the Douglas factors, the reason it's called that, there was a court case in 1981 by an employee named Douglas against the Veterans Administration. And the Merit Systems Protection Board has determined that these are a real good set of factors that need to be addressed in order to determine the appropriateness of the penalty that you've selected. Supervisors need to always look at these to make sure that the determination that they've made is reasonable and that they have a conscientious application of these factors as they go through trying to decide what type of discipline. If you use the Douglas factors and jot down your answers or things that go with them as you move through this process, you have a much better opportunity, your odds are better, if you will. If the action goes before a third party, if you've addressed all of them appropriately, you're going to have a much better chance of prevailing in what you've proposed or decided to do. We've looked at, in the table of penalties, remember, we looked at a range of penalties that are suggested. So as you work through the Douglas factors, it helps you decide what in that range or out of that range is appropriate. So let's take a look at them. There are 12 Douglas factors. We're going to go through them kind of quickly because there's a lot of things that we have already talked about, so I'll try not to repeat myself. The first one is the nature and seriousness of the offense. And that goes to the relation to the employee's duties, their position, all of those things. How did that affect what they did? How did that affect, was it bad enough to warrant some type of a disciplinary action? As you're doing your investigation and you find out, that's the things that you want to jot down as in relation to this factor. Was it inadvertent? Did they do it on purpose? Was it an error on their part? Was it, is there a nexus? Remember we talked about that. We're going to talk, those are all kind of interconnected, but this one is definitely the most important one, the one that the third party is definitely going to look at. It's considered first and foremost that you have established this connection between the nature and seriousness of the offense and what the employee is doing. Not all of these factors apply in every circumstance either. That's important to remember, and some of them, depending on the circumstance, might be a mitigating factor or an aggravating factor, depending on what your answers are to each individual factor. The second one is, what is the nature of the employee's position? The MSPB has determined that people that are in positions of public trust are held to a higher standard than the rest of than other folks for behaving appropriately in the workplace. Supervisors, law enforcement officers, judges, people that are in fiduciary positions, handle a lot of money, have responsibility for those types of things. Human resource professionals, we're all in that higher category where the level of expectation is higher. So when you behave badly, that has more of a serious effect on your position. You want to look at basically what you're asking in this is, can their supervisor truly still trust this person? It's very much related to number 5, and we'll talk a little bit more about that when we get to number 5. Okay, number 3, does the employee have a past disciplinary record? We just talked about that a little bit. This definitely goes to that conduct or that concept of progressive discipline. Have you been reasonable in what you've done? Have you not assigned a penalty when you've not tried to correct the problem before at a lesser level? And if there was a pattern that was established by prior discipline, that's something that you'll want to show in this particular factor. Number 4, looking at the employee's past work record, their length of service. How long have they been an employee of the agency? How long have they been an employee of the federal government? This is one of those factors that can kind of go either way. You might think if you have a 30-year employee that's going to be a mitigating factor for them because they've been around for so long. Well, It might be, but what if they've been in that position, the same position, for 30 years, and doggone it, they should have known better. They know that's unacceptable behavior. That might actually become an aggravating factor in that case that would be looked at. Performance ratings are key in this one. If you're trying to take a disciplinary action for an employee and you're maybe referencing something that, you know, well, they've always had performance problems, and you've always given them a level 5 or a level 3, even a satisfactory rating, you're kind of contradicting yourself. So you want to be really sure that everything meshes together when you look at this particular one for your employee. The fifth one, what is the impact on the employee's ability to effectively perform their duties? We talked about this a little bit when we went through number 1. Does the supervisor still have confidence that this employee can perform their duties? This is one where off-duty misconduct kind of really comes into play as far as, you know, even if it happened off the job. Does the supervisor have confidence that this is not going to affect how they perform their job? For instance, a really good example of that might be if you have a motor vehicle operator who received a DUI. Now, not only is that a conduct problem, and this happened, you know, while they were on vacation or something, you know, is that something that's going to have an effect on their job? Probably. Maybe it's a condition of employment that they hold a certain type of license. Maybe they'll lose it. That's one of the things you want to consider in this one. Be sure you don't talk out of both sides of your mouth on this one. I have spoken to supervisors in the past, and they are so angry at an employee. They're so frustrated because they've done something wrong. But, you know, I really, really need Joe to do this project for me. It's really important. Joe's the only one that can do it. So I'm going to take I want the disciplinary action to happen after he does this. You know, that's a real consideration for you as a supervisor, but you're definitely sending a mixed message there. Don't give that task should not be so important that it has to wait, that you're taking a disciplinary action. If it's that important, you need to find someone else to do that task and deal with the disciplinary action. Okay, on number 6, you want to look at the consistency of penalties imposed on other employees for similar offenses. Now, this one sounds pretty daunting. That it's not quite as set in stone as it sounds like, and quite honestly, it's very difficult to find other employees that are truly in similar situations. Means that they have to be essentially the same job, same organization, same working circumstances. They've had the same number of disciplinary actions, the same, all of that stuff has to be the same. Rather, what I think you want to look at in this one is, are you being consistent within the people that are in your control? Not that you're just mad at Joe because he did something really wrong, and maybe Sally did the same thing wrong a couple of months ago and you didn't say anything to her. Make sure that you're enforcing the rules consistently. I think that's the big one that you want to be concerned about, is consistency on this one. Number 7, is the penalty that you've chosen consistent with the table of penalties? Now, as you're analyzing this, you need to show that you've consulted the table of penalties and you've taken into consideration whatever that penalty that was recommended is. And so as a result of that, you've chosen something that's within that range, or due to the other circumstances, you've chosen something else that is at a lower level. As long as you kind of analyze that and put that out in your information, that should hold forth before a third party. Okay, number 8. What is there notoriety involved in this particular incident of misconduct? Another one where off-duty misconduct really comes into play. The one that we talked about earlier, where the employee punched another employee in the face in the workplace. What if that occurred in the bar downtown. And many of us in the Department of Interior, we do work in some pretty isolated and remote locations. Maybe there's a small town nearby, you know, has the police blotter. They don't put the names in there usually, but everybody in town knows who that is. And let's say that Joe was a supervisor. Do you think that might have an impact on the notoriety, an impact on the efficiency of the service and give a bad name, sort of, to the location? It might. Something you definitely want to look at. That's one way that off-duty misconduct makes that nexus to the job. Okay? It definitely goes back to a lot of those prerequisites we talked about earlier. Number 9, the clarity of the notice. Again, back to those prerequisites. Have you clearly communicated to your employees that there's a rule or something that either prohibits this or something that they've been required to do that they're not doing? You need to make sure that you show that clearly in your documentation. Number 10, what's the potential for rehabilitation for the employee? This is, you know, does your employee show a level of remorse after you've talked to them about this? Are they really sorry for what they've done? Or, you know, did they say, well, and doggone it, I'd do the same thing over again? You know, mitigating or aggravating, it kind of depends. This is one, too, that can go either way. And you need, remember, you need to look at all of these in conjunction together, not just one of them separately. One might hold more weight, but you want to look at them all as a whole. Number 11, mitigating circumstances. We've already talked about where some of the previous factors can become mitigating circumstances, but some things that are most often raised by employees are that they're under unusual job stress. You know, well, aren't we all? Anyway, but sometimes employees will use that. They'll bring that forward when they have their opportunity to respond. Maybe they're having some personal issues that maybe you weren't even aware of. Maybe they're going through a divorce. Maybe they had a death in the family, something that's affected them deeply, especially if this is something that just kind of popped up. Maybe they have some type of an illness or a medical condition. They're going to raise some type of an affirmative defense on a medical issue that you're going to have to look at doing a reasonable accommodation for. It's a whole other class to talk about that, but that comes up quite a bit too, I think, as we move through this process. Maybe they just tell you, you know, I never did get along. My supervisor never did get along with me. He just doesn't like me. There's bad blood between us. He's always been out to get me. Those kinds of things are circumstances that you have to consider if the employee raises them. You may think that they're just a deferment of the issue and they're trying to take you off track, but I guarantee you that MSPB is going to consider those things if the employee has an opportunity to present their case before a third party. So you need to be sure that you're aware of them and show that you've considered them, at least. And the last one is alternative sanctions. Did you consider alternative sanctions and decide that they weren't adequate? Did you take a different type of action initially, some type of counseling or a letter of warning or something that was, you know, that didn't work, or you don't believe that's going to be a sufficient thing to correct the problem? You don't have to prove it. You just have to show that you've considered it and you don't think it'll be effective. Okay, lots of information on the Douglas factors. Typically what I do when I have a supervisor come to me with an issue, I'll give them a copy of this and just ask them to bring back their thoughts on it. Doesn't need to be anything formal. You don't need to write an essay or a book, just so that you can put things in perspective